The story begins with a quiet, almost serene view of the late 1980s Midwest. Long stretches of farmland pass by in the distance, cornfields swaying under the summer wind, while highways cut clean through the open landscape. The small towns nestled along the roadside seem calm, untouched by the rush of big cities, carrying the slow rhythm of rural life. Into this world came a young woman whose story would not just ripple through her family, but would leave a haunting scar on an entire community. Tammy Zywicki was not just another college student. She was a young woman brimming with ambition, energy, and a sense of adventure. She had been born and raised in the quiet comfort of the suburbs, where family values and neighborhood bonds shaped her character. Those who knew her best often said she carried herself with an almost magnetic warmth, the kind that drew people toward her without effort. Her smile reflected optimism, and her eyes carried a curiosity about the world that felt boundless. She was the kind of person who seemed destined to leave her mark, not by extraordinary fame or power, but through the genuine way she connected with others. And yet, it would be that same curiosity and independence that placed her on a path leading to the fateful events along Interstate 80. A simple, ordinary day, one like any other, would soon change everything forever. Her family remembered Tammy in ways that highlighted the depth of her character. They saw her as diligent, the kind of daughter who followed through with her responsibilities without needing reminders. She was responsible, steady, and trustworthy, someone you could depend on without hesitation. But beyond that discipline, she had an independence that showed early. She knew how to manage her time, how to balance her obligations, and how to carve space for her own ambitions. Her parents admired this about her, but they so sometimes worried. Not because Tammy was reckless, but because independence often required stepping out into the world on her own. Her siblings saw her as a role model, someone they could look up to, someone who seemed to carry the right mix of determination and kindness. For them, Tammy wasn't just a sister, she was a guide. Her close friends, too, had their own memories that seemed to stitch together the image of who she truly was. They described her as the type of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. Conversations with her weren't just about small talk. She had a way of making you feel seen, a way of leaving an impression that stuck with you long after. To them, she wasn't just another face on campus. She was unforgettable. Even professors noticed her presence. In college, she excelled academically, yet she never let that dedication keep her from the social side of student life. She balanced essays, exams, and lectures with friendships, gatherings, and late-night conversations. She embodied the life of a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, standing at the threshold of the life she had always imagined. Tammy had plans that weren't grand in the eyes of the world, but ones that carried the weight of her own personal dreams. She wanted a career that mattered, one where she could leave her own footprint. She dreamed of travel, of seeing the places that existed beyond the Midwest horizon. She wanted to build connections, meaningful ones, with the people she cared for most. Her life was the portrait of relatability. She was not unlike so many others, students, daughters, friends, sisters, each full of aspirations, each walking their own path. And in that relatability lies the power of her story. Because when tragedy struck, it wasn't just Tammy who was lost. It was every dream she carried, every relationship she nurtured, every plan she had to fulfill. The audience is reminded that behind every news headline, behind every case number, there is a human life, fragile and irreplaceable. As the narration deepens, the setting begins to take shape, guiding the audience toward the events of her final journey. It was the summer of 1989. Tammy, like so many young people in that era, found herself behind the wheel of a car, navigating the open highways that cut through the center of America. The Midwest was a region defined by its roads, where long drives often connected the dots between towns, schools, and family. Interstate 80 was one of those arteries, a road stretching endlessly across the horizon, carrying with it the rhythm of the country. The camera pans across its lanes, wide, steady, and seemingly endless. Trucks rumbled along in steady convoys, their trailers catching the glint of the sun. Cars hummed by, their engines blending into the whisper of the wind. To most, these highways represented freedom. They symbolized independence, the ability to go wherever you wanted, whenever you wanted. They were roads of possibility, of journeys that stretched farther than the eye could see. For Tammy, too, Interstate 80 was a route to the future she was carving. But what no one knew then was that this very stretch of road, one that so many had traveled safely, would soon become the site of a haunting mystery and a tragic ending. The outline of Tammy's life makes it clear why her story is so compelling. She was not careless. She was not reckless. She was meticulous, careful, and thoughtful in how she lived her life. Her friends often joked that Tammy had everything in order, from her schedules to her small daily decisions. She carried the kind of responsibility that reassured those around her. Yet, like any young person, she allowed herself small moments of adventure. She was open to the little detours life sometimes presented. She might choose to hitch a ride with someone she trusted if the circumstances called for it. She might take the scenic route instead of the quickest one, simply to enjoy the experience. These decisions were not signs of recklessness. They were signs of humanity. They were the same choices anyone could make, the kind of choices that seem ordinary until they intersect with something darker. Her family trusted her judgment. Her parents had faith in the independence she displayed, even if it sometimes made them nervous. Her siblings admired her ability to stand on her own 2 feet. Her friends believed she could handle whatever situation came her way, and most of the time, they were right. But the road has its own unpredictability. Highways carry not just travelers seeking freedom, but strangers whose intentions are unknown. For every trucker carrying cargo, every student heading home, and every family on vacation, there are others whose presence is harder to define. Tammy's story is a reminder of that vulnerability. It's a reminder that no matter how careful we are, no matter how much trust we place in ourselves, there are moments in life when randomness collides with fate. The narrative lingers on that tension. The randomness of the road, the unpredictability of strangers, the fine line between safety and danger. Tammy's loved ones would later ask themselves over and over, how could something so ordinary, a road trip, a stretch of highway, become the stage for tragedy? And yet that is the haunting truth. The highways that connect lives also expose them. The freedom they symbolize also carries risk. And Tammy Zywicki, with all her dreams, her independence, and her humanity, became caught in that delicate balance. Her story begins not in the tragedy itself, but in the life she lived before it. In the laughter she shared with her friends, the responsibilities she upheld for her family, the ambitions she carried into adulthood. It begins in the optimism of a young woman whose entire future lay ahead, and in the ordinariness of a road trip that should have been just another chapter in a full, unfolding life. It begins with the innocence of trust, the open roads of the Midwest, and the idea that tomorrow would always come. But for Tammy, tomorrow would never arrive. It was the summer of 1989, a time when the roads of America stretched wide and endless, filled with both promise and uncertainty. For Tammy Zywicki, the season carried with it the anticipation of new beginnings, familiar connections, and the simple joy of travel. After a busy college year, she was ready to make the drive back home, to reconnect with her family and friends. Road trips had always been part of her routine, something she managed with independence and care. She had made journeys like this before. They had always been safe. They had always been uneventful. But this time, everything would be different. Her preparations were thoughtful, deliberate, almost methodical. Tammy wasn't someone who rushed through details. Her small car, a modest and reliable vehicle, reflected her personality, practical, organized, steady. She packed it with precision, ensuring her belongings were neatly arranged. Clothing folded carefully into a suitcase, books stacked in the back seat, a map tucked close by, its creases already worn from prior trips. A few personal items, little comforts of familiarity, rested within reach. Each decision revealed a part of her character, her independence, her reliability, and her maturity. Before setting off, Tammy moved through the small rituals that made her feel prepared. She adjusted the rearview mirror until it was just right. She checked the fuel gauge, made sure the dashboard lights glowed as they should, and glanced at her map one last time to confirm the route she knew so well. There may have even been a brief moment of excitement, the quiet thrill of the open road ahead. It was ordinary, simple, yet meaningful. These details, so routine in the moment, would later stand as fragments of a story that people would replay again and again, trying to understand how something so normal could end so tragically. When Tammy merged onto Interstate 80, the world seemed to open before her. The highway stretched endlessly, a ribbon of asphalt cutting across the landscape. It was one of the country's great roadways, linking states, carrying travelers, truckers, and families on journeys both short and long. On that summer day, it offered Tammy both freedom and isolation. The steady hum of engines filled the air, the rhythmic thrum of her own tires a constant background. Now and then, the deep, echoing blast of a semi-truck horn pierced the quiet, a reminder of the larger, heavier machines that shared the road. The scenery shifted as miles passed. Urban clusters faded into stretches of open plains. Fields extended far into the horizon, broken only by the occasional farmhouse or distant tree line. The sunlight shifted overhead, warm against the windshield, creating a steady rhythm between her and the road. Yet with every mile, a quiet tension lingered beneath the surface. Interstate 80 was not just vast, it was lonely. Its distance, its emptiness, carried both freedom and risk. Along the way, Tammy likely made small, ordinary stops, the kinds of pauses every traveler knows well. At a gas station, she might have pulled in, fueled up, and taken a brief moment to stretch her legs. Maybe she exchanged a polite smile with an attendant, offered a quick thank you as she paid, or grabbed a cold soda from a vending machine before returning to the car. Such moments were fleeting, easily forgotten at the time, yet now they hold weight. They reveal her humanity, her ordinariness, the fact that she was just like anyone else on a long road trip, and they remind us that even the smallest interactions, even the simplest choices, can intersect with fate. Hours into the journey, something shifted. Her car, steady until then, began to falter. Maybe it started with a stutter in the rhythm of the engine. Perhaps a warning light flickered on the dashboard, glowing faintly but urgently. Tammy, careful and attentive, would not have ignored it. She eased her way to the side of the highway, guiding the vehicle toward the shoulder. Dust rose as her tires left the asphalt, crunching onto the gravel of the roadside. It was a small, ordinary breakdown, the kind of inconvenience that happens to drivers every day. Yet in this setting, it was different. On a busy city street surrounded by people and resources, such a moment would barely register. But here, on the long and empty stretches of Interstate 80, the stakes were different. Help was not guaranteed. Traffic was sparse. The land around her felt open yet isolating. And the sun, inching across the sky, marked time that she did not have control over. Tammy's instincts would have guided her next steps. She was independent, thoughtful, and careful. She may have opened the hood, peering inside, hoping for a simple answer, a loose connection, something she could fix or wait out. She might have walked around the car, weighing her options, calculating whether to stay put or flag someone down. There was no panic in these decisions. They were rational, measured, the kinds of steps anyone in her position would have taken. But that's what makes them haunting, because in their normalcy, they show us how easily the ordinary can become extraordinary, how quickly safety can shift into danger. Standing on the roadside, Tammy would have been visible to others, passing drivers, long-haul truckers, or the occasional traveler making their own way across the interstate. Most encounters on highways like this were safe, routine, and forgettable. A passing glance, a nod of acknowledgement, a shared understanding between travelers of the open road. But the late 1980s also carried with them stories whispered into the national consciousness, stories of travelers who vanished, of highways that became corridors of danger as well as freedom. As the day wore on, the environment added its own weight to her situation. The wind swept across the flat plains, carrying with it the scent of asphalt and dust. The horizon stretched endlessly, but nearby houses or businesses were nowhere in sight. The occasional distant headlights drew closer, only to fade again as vehicles passed. The sound of the road, the rushing air, the hiss of tires, was both familiar and unsettling. For Tammy, each decision mattered. Each moment on the side of that highway carried possibilities, some safe, others unthinkable. The truth is that she did what anyone might have done. She trusted the road, trusted the idea that help would come. She believed in the ordinary kindness of strangers, in the reliability of human decency. And in most circumstances, she would have been right. But on this day, on this highway, the ordinary was not enough. This moment, her car breaking down, her waiting on the roadside, was the pivot point. Everything that followed, everything that would transform her life into one of the country's most haunting unsolved mysteries, began here. She stood vulnerable yet strong, cautious yet hopeful. And around her, the interstate stretched silent and indifferent, holding secrets it would never willingly give away. The road that symbolized freedom had become something else, and Tammy Zywicki, a young woman full of life, stood at its edge, unaware that she was stepping into a story that would capture the nation's attention and remain unanswered for decades. It was Sunday, August 23, 1992. The Midwest sun hung high in the late summer sky, warming the endless stretch of interstate that cut across the heart of Illinois. The air shimmered with heat above the asphalt, and cars hummed steadily along Interstate 80. Somewhere near mile marker 83 in LaSalle County, a young woman's journey came to a halt. Her name was Tammy Jo Zywicki. She was only 21 years old. That morning, Tammy had set out with a clear purpose. She was driving her white 1985 Pontiac T1000, making the familiar trip from Evanston, Illinois to Grinnell College in Iowa, where she was returning for her senior year. She had packed her belongings, said goodbye to her family, and hit the road with the energy and anticipation of a student heading back to campus life. Tammy was disciplined and responsible. She had made this journey many times before. She knew the route, she knew the hours it would take, and she knew she would be home by nightfall in her college town, ready to embrace the routine of another semester. But this trip would not go as planned. Somewhere on that long, monotonous highway, her car began to struggle. Mechanical issues forced her to pull over onto the shoulder near mile marker 83. For drivers and passing vehicles, the sight was unremarkable. A car stopped on the side of the interstate, hazard lights blinking in the heat. To strangers on the road, it was a scene easily dismissed. But for Tammy, it marked the beginning of her disappearance. Witnesses later reported seeing a tractor-trailer pulled over near Tammy's Pontiac. The driver was described as a white male, somewhere between 35 and 40 years old. He stood over 6 feet tall and had dark, bushy hair. Some accounts suggested that he may have been offering help, perhaps stepping in to check on the stranded young woman. Others said he may have simply pulled off nearby, a chance. The encounter at the worst possible moment. But no one could say for sure what had happened in those fleeting minutes on the side of the interstate. What followed remains a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. The details of Tammy's interaction with that truck driver are murky, blurred by time and memory. Did she speak with him? Did she accept his help? Did she feel she had no choice? There is no record of their conversation, no confirmed evidence of what passed between them. All that is known is that Tammy vanished soon after that sighting. Later that afternoon, an Illinois State Police trooper came across her abandoned Pontiac on the shoulder of the road. There was no sign of Tammy anywhere nearby. Believing it to be a routine case of vehicle trouble, the officer ticketed the car for abandonment. Eventually, it was towed away by the Illinois State Police. At that moment, no one yet realized that Tammy was missing. To the officer on patrol, it was simply a stranded vehicle, one of many that break down on busy interstates. But Tammy's absence did not go unnoticed for long. That evening, her mother, Joanne Zywicki, grew worried. Tammy had been expected at Grinnell College. She had always been diligent about checking in, responsible about her plans. When she didn't arrive as scheduled, alarm bells began to ring for her family. Joanne reported her daughter missing later that night. To her, the silence was out of character and deeply unsettling. Something had gone wrong. At first, law enforcement hesitated. Like so many young adults reported missing, Tammy's case was met with speculation and doubt. Authorities floated the possibility that she might have left on her own, perhaps with a boyfriend. But Tammy's family quickly pushed back. She didn't have a boyfriend. There was no evidence that she had planned to meet anyone, no indication she intended to abandon her trip. She was on her way to college, returning to a life she loved, with responsibilities she never would have ignored. The suggestion that she had run away made no sense to those who knew her best. As hours turned into days, the worst fears began to take shape. Tammy had vanished without explanation, and the last known sighting of her placed her with a man who had never come forward. 9 days later, those fears were confirmed in the most devastating way. On September 1st, 1992, a truck driver traveling along Interstate 44 in Lawrence County, Missouri, spotted something on the side of the road. He stopped, and there he discovered the body of Tammy Zywicki. The location was hundreds of miles away from where she had last been seen. Tammy's body was wrapped in a red blanket and secured with duct tape. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. The brutality of her murder shocked everyone who heard the news. Tammy, the bright and responsible college student, had been taken from the side of an interstate, held against her will, and killed in a way that suggested both rage and calculation. Whoever had done this had traveled far from Illinois, choosing to abandon her body along another highway corridor in Missouri. For her family, the confirmation was shattering. For law enforcement, it was the beginning of a case that remains unsolved to this day. When investigators searched for answers, they quickly realized that several of Tammy's personal belongings were missing. Her Canon 35mm camera, something she often carried to capture memories, was gone. So was her musical wristwatch, a unique piece that might have stood out if it appeared later in pawn shops or private collections. These missing items were potential clues, objects that could one day link her killer to the crime. But despite alerts and inquiries, they have never been recovered. The investigation turned its focus to the truck driver seen near Tammy's car on Interstate 80. He matched a general description, but no one knew his name. No license plate was recorded, no trucking company was identified. In an industry where thousands of vehicles crisscross highways every day, the task of finding one man, one truck, became almost impossible. Still, authorities believed he could hold the key to what happened. Whether he had harmed Tammy himself or passed her along to someone else, his role could not be ignored. Law enforcement pieced together what they could. They documented Tammy's last known movements, the timeline of her journey, the location of her abandoned car, and the tragic discovery of her body 9 days later. Witness reports were carefully logged. Forensic evidence was collected from the scene in Missouri. But despite the effort, no arrests were ever made. For Tammy's family, the lack of answers was unbearable. Joanne Zywicki spoke publicly about her daughter, refusing to let her name be forgotten. She described Tammy not as a faceless victim, but as a vibrant young woman with a future stolen too soon. She kept the pressure on law enforcement, urging them never to give up. The FBI eventually joined the investigation, treating it as a case that crossed state lines. Theories swirled. Was Tammy targeted by a long-haul trucker? Was she a victim of opportunity, or had someone followed her intentionally? Some speculated about serial offenders known to prey on young women along highways during the 1980s and 1990s. But without physical evidence tying any suspect to Tammy's murder, the case remained at a standstill. Decades have now passed, and Tammy's story remains one of the Midwest's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. The image of her car sitting abandoned on the shoulder of Interstate 80 has become symbolic of the randomness and vulnerability of roadside encounters. The red blanket used to conceal her body remains one of the most chilling details of the case. and the missing camera and wristwatch linger as silent reminders of a crime yet to be solved. Each year, Tammy's family and friends continue to honor her memory, keeping alive the hope that someone, somewhere, knows the truth. Law enforcement maintains the case as open, always revisiting leads when new information surfaces. But as of today, no suspect has been identified, and no one has been held accountable for her murder. Tammy Jo Zywicki's story is not just about an unsolved crime. It is about the fragility of life, the dangers that can hide in ordinary moments, and the pain of families left without answers. A 21-year-old college student set out on a trip that should have been routine. Instead, her life was taken, and her future erased on the side of an American highway. After Tammy Jo Zywicki failed to arrive at Grinnell College, her mother, Joanne Zywicki, reported her missing on the evening of August 23, 1992. Joanne had expected a call or a sign of arrival from her daughter, but none came. Tammy was punctual and dependable, and she had never left her mother to worry without an explanation. Alarm turned into fear as Joanne realized something was terribly wrong. When her report reached law enforcement, they began the urgent process of documenting Tammy's last known movements. They traced her departure from Evanston, Illinois earlier that day, noting her intended route along Interstate 80 toward Iowa. She had been driving her white 1985 Pontiac T1000, a small vehicle that would have been easy to spot along the highway. As investigators checked along her route, they quickly learned that Tammy's car had already been found. An Illinois State Police trooper had come across the Pontiac near mile marker 83 in LaSalle County. It was sitting alone on the shoulder of the road. At the time, the trooper had treated it as an abandoned vehicle. A ticket was issued, and the car was later towed to a secure location for examination. The Pontiac was a vital starting point. It was Tammy's last confirmed location, and it could hold clues about what happened after she was forced to stop her journey. Officers began to collect statements from drivers and passers-by who might have seen something unusual on the interstate that day. Several witnesses reported a strikingly similar detail. Tammy had been seen standing beside her disabled car, and near her, a tractor-trailer had been spotted. The description of the trucker who had been in the area was consistent across multiple accounts. He was described as a white male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, over 6 feet tall with dark bushy hair. The image of this unknown man became an immediate focus of attention. Law enforcement considered the possibility that this trucker had stopped to help Tammy, or that he had interacted with her in some way. But the precise nature of their contact was unclear. Had she accepted his assistance willingly, or had she been coerced? Was he a passerby who noticed her stranded car, or was his presence part of a darker plan? No direct evidence at the time linked him to Tammy's disappearance, but his proximity to her car made him a critical figure in the investigation. As they searched for more answers, investigators widened their lens. They began to review potential leads beyond the highway sighting. They asked whether Tammy had arranged to meet anyone during her trip. They looked into her personal life, her college schedules, and her circle of contacts. Each angle was examined to rule out the possibility of voluntary absence. In the early stages, some officers raised the possibility that Tammy had chosen to leave on her own. It was a familiar theory in missing persons cases, but those who knew her rejected it outright. Her family emphasized that Tammy had no reason to run away. Friends and fellow students confirmed that she had no boyfriend, no hidden relationships, no secret plans that would explain her vanishing. She was dedicated to her studies and to her family. She was responsible, practical, and rooted in her life in Evanston and at Grinnell College. The theory of voluntary disappearance quickly lost ground as the evidence showed no support for it. With those possibilities fading, the investigation intensified. Searches were coordinated along Interstate 80 and in the surrounding areas. Law enforcement reviewed traffic flow along the highway, noted distances between exits, and mapped nearby towns where Tammy might have been seen. They monitored truck stops, rest areas, and service plazas. Surveillance opportunities in 1992 were limited, but officers checked for any cameras or recorded logs that might capture vehicle activity. The aim was to create a clear timeline of Tammy's movements from the point her car was disabled until her disappearance. Her Pontiac was also carefully examined. Investigators studied its condition, looking for signs of tampering, mechanical interference, or anything that might indicate foul play. Forensic specialists photographed the vehicle, checked tire wear, examined fluids, and tested its battery and ignition systems. The condition of the car suggested genuine mechanical problems rather than sabotage. Still, the vehicle's roadside position told little about what had happened to Tammy after she stepped out of it. Because the case involved travel across state lines, federal authorities soon became involved. The FBI joined local and state investigators in reviewing the evidence. They opened files on Tammy's disappearance, compiled witness accounts, and checked for patterns in similar cases. Highway abductions were not unprecedented, and Tammy's age, circumstances, and sudden disappearance made her case high priority. Federal involvement meant broad ease, more resources, deeper databases, and the ability to cross-check with other incidents nationwide. Law enforcement also turned to the public for help. Appeals for information were broadcast on television and radio. Newspapers in Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri reported Tammy's disappearance. Descriptions of her appearance, her clothing, and the white Pontiac T1000 were circulated. Special attention was given to the detail of the tractor trailer near her car. Flyers were distributed to trucking companies, truck stops, and law enforcement offices along the Interstate corridor. Authorities hoped that someone might remember seeing a trucker who fit the description, or perhaps recognize the man himself. Inside the Pontiac, investigators collected and examined Tammy's personal items. They looked for anything that might suggest who she had interacted with or what she had planned. Forensic teams searched the vehicle for fingerprints, fibers, or other physical traces. They documented the roadside around mile marker 83, noting tire tracks, debris, and disturbances in the grass. Every detail was logged, no matter how small, in the hope of constructing a sequence of events. Investigators cross-referenced witness statements with their physical findings. If a truck had been near Tammy's car, they wanted to know where it might have pulled over, how long it had stayed, and where it might have gone afterward. Truck traffic logs were reviewed to identify vehicles that might have matched the witness's description. Although not every trucking company maintained detailed logs in 1992, investigators reached out to dispatchers and employers for any leads that could connect drivers to the area at the time. Coordination stretched across jurisdictions. Local police worked with county authorities, while state police agencies communicated with their counterparts in neighboring regions. Highway patrol units increased their visibility along Interstate 80, keeping a lookout for suspicious vehicles or drivers who matched the description. Officers also visited nearby towns and service stations, speaking with employees and residents. They asked if anyone had seen a young woman traveling alone, if anyone had been approached by a trucker offering assistance, or if anyone had noticed suspicious behavior in the days surrounding August 23rd. In those first crucial days, investigators also considered possible motives and suspects. While no one specific emerged immediately, attention focused on individuals known to frequent the highway. Truckers, travelers, and motorists in the vicinity of the Pontiac became the subjects of scrutiny. Investigators reviewed driver logs, examined commercial vehicle registrations, and looked for patterns of movement that could coincide with Tammy's disappearance. Each possibility was explored, though none led to a clear breakthrough. What investigators did accomplish in those early days was the establishment of a solid timeline. They documented Tammy's departure from Evanston. They traced her expected path along Interstate 80. They pinpointed the location of her disabled Pontiac near mile marker 83. They confirmed the witnesses who saw her standing beside it. They recorded the presence of the tractor trailer and the description of the driver. These details, though limited, became the foundation of the case. The timeline would serve as a guide for all future efforts to solve the mystery. Despite the urgency of the search and the involvement of multiple agencies, Tammy remained missing. Days turned into a week, and then into more. For her family, the wait was unbearable. They clung to hope, even as each passing hour made the outcome feel more uncertain. Then, on September 1, 1992, the search came to a tragic conclusion. Along Interstate 44 in Lawrence County, Missouri, between the cities of Springfield and Joplin, a truck driver spotted something unusual on the roadside. When he stopped to look, he found the body of a young woman. Authorities were called immediately. Identification confirmed what Tammy's family had feared most. It was Tammy Jo Zywicki. The discovery shifted the case instantly from a missing person investigation to a homicide investigation. Tammy had been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. Her body was wrapped in a red blanket and sealed with duct tape, suggesting an attempt to conceal or transport her. The brutality of her murder stunned investigators and devastated her loved ones. As they processed the crime scene, investigators noted that some of Tammy's personal belongings were missing. Her Canon 35mm camera, a piece of equipment she valued, was gone. Her musical wristwatch, known for its unique design, was also missing. These missing items became potential evidence. If they surfaced in pawn shops, private collections, or in possession of a suspect, they could provide the link investigators desperately needed. But despite alerts and monitoring, neither item has ever been recovered. The discovery in Missouri expanded the scope of the case. Federal coordination increased, as the crime had now crossed multiple states. Forensic analysis of the blanket, the tape, and the body began immediately. Witness accounts from Interstate 80 were reviewed again in the light of this new evidence. Authorities considered whether Tammy's abductor had been a long-haul trucker, using the interstate network to move between states quickly. Public appeals intensified. News reports now focused on Tammy's murder, urging anyone with information about suspicious truckers, vehicles, or encounters to step forward. The FBI tracked similar unsolved cases involving young women on highways. They compared details, looking for patterns of behavior that might indicate a serial offender. Attention turned again to the trucking community. Investigators studied the patterns of long-haul drivers, the routes that pass through Illinois and Missouri, and the schedules that might align with Tammy's disappearance. They reviewed registrations, searched driver records, and consulted with trucking companies. They wanted to know if any driver fit the description of the man with dark, bushy hair, and whether any driver had an unexplained absence or suspicious behavior in late August 1992. Despite these efforts, no immediate arrests were made. The case remained unsolved, with investigators holding on to witness accounts, forensic evidence, and the haunting details of Tammy's final days. The foundation built during the initial response, the timeline, the car, the truck sightings, the public appeals, remains critical even today. It is a record of the efforts made in those first days, a framework for the ongoing search for answers, and a reminder of the determination to bring justice to Tammy Jo Zywicki. 9 days after her disappearance, on September 1, 1992, the tragic discovery of Tammy Jo Zywicki's body marked the darkest turning point in the investigation. What had begun as a missing person case was now unquestionably a homicide investigation. The transition was immediate and stark. What law enforcement had feared became reality, and every effort shifted toward understanding how Tammy's journey ended in violence and death. It was a truck driver traveling along Interstate 44 in Lawrence County, Missouri, who made the grim discovery. The location was between Springfield and Joplin, hundreds of miles from where Tammy's Pontiac T1000 had been found abandoned in Illinois. This discovery alone raised immediate and pressing questions. How had Tammy traveled such a long distance from where she was last seen? Who had taken her there? And why had she been killed with such brutality? When authorities arrived at the scene, their first priority was securing the area to preserve every possible piece of evidence. Investigators documented everything with painstaking precision. The exact location of Tammy's body was noted in relation to the highway, the slope of the roadside, and the vegetation around her. They photographed the scene extensively from multiple angles, capturing the placement of her body, the red blanket she was wrapped in, and the duct tape that sealed it. Tire tracks were examined. Soil and plant life around the area were studied for impressions or disturbances. Every element was logged carefully, recognizing the importance of these details in reconstructing what had happened. The medical examiner's findings painted an even more harrowing picture. Tammy Jo Zywicki had been sexually assaulted. She had been stabbed multiple times, with the wounds suggesting rage or deliberate infliction rather than a single act. Each wound was measured, photographed, and documented. For forensic analysis, the medical examiner collected biological samples from her body, including semen, blood, and other trace evidence, to be analyzed in specialized laboratories. At the time, DNA profiling was an emerging forensic tool, and investigators recognized its potential importance in eventually linking a suspect to the crime. Several of Tammy's personal belongings were missing. Among them were a Canon 35mm camera and a musical wristwatch. The absence of these items raised questions about motive. Were they taken as trophies by the killer? Were they stolen to mislead investigators into believing robbery was the central reason for the crime? Or were they removed simply to obscure evidence that could identify the perpetrator? Each possibility was considered as the investigation progressed. The distance between the locations in Illinois and Missouri created immediate challenges for law enforcement. Tammy's car had been found near mile marker 83 on Interstate 80 in LaSalle County, Illinois. Her body, however, was discovered approximately 350 miles away along Interstate 44. This gap indicated that Tammy had been transported across state lines, turning the case into a federal matter. It was no longer contained to one jurisdiction. Instead, multiple state police agencies, local law enforcement, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were required to coordinate. Authorities worked to reconstruct the timeline between August 23rd, when Tammy was last seen, and September 1st, when her body was discovered. Witness reports were central to this effort. Several motorists had reported seeing Tammy by her disabled Pontiac T1000 on Interstate 80. These same witnesses recalled a tractor-trailer parked nearby at the time. The driver of that truck was described as a white male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, over 6 feet tall, with dark, bushy hair. This description was added to investigative files and circulated among trucking companies, weigh stations, and law enforcement patrols. While there was no definitive proof that the truck driver was involved in Tammy's disappearance, investigators considered him a person of interest due to the timing and circumstances of the sighting. The red blanket itself became a critical piece of evidence. Forensic teams examined its fibers, weave, and potential origins. They considered whether the blanket could be traced to a specific manufacturer or trucking company, narrowing down where it might have come from. The duct tape sealing the blanket was also analyzed for fingerprints, fibers, or unique production markers that could be linked to a particular brand or batch. Every item, from soil samples near the body to the tape that bound the blanket, was handled with meticulous chain-of-custody procedures to ensure that any evidence remained admissible in court. At the same time, investigators revisited Tammy's abandoned vehicle in Illinois. The Pontiac T1000 was inspected again for any overlooked details. The condition of the engine, the tires, and the car's interior were all documented. Authorities searched for fingerprints, hair, or fibers that might not have been visible during the initial tow and inspection. They also considered whether the vehicle had been tampered with to force Tammy into pulling over. And though no conclusive evidence supported this theory, still, its breakdown remained a central event, the moment that left her vulnerable on the roadside. Federal involvement widened the scope of the investigation. The FBI examined the case not only as a singular tragedy, but also in relation to other unsolved cases along interstate highways. They reviewed past reports of missing women, unsolved assaults, and violent encounters connected to long-haul trucking routes. Given Tammy's body had been left along a major trucking corridor, the possibility of a serial offender was considered. Case files were cross-referenced for patterns, similarities, or overlapping descriptions of suspects and vehicles. Forensic labs worked to process the biological samples taken from Tammy's body. DNA was in its early stages of use in criminal cases, but it was still regarded as potentially groundbreaking evidence if a suspect could later be matched. Clothing fibers, soil samples, and even small hairs were analyzed under microscopes, each potentially offering a link between Tammy, the location in Missouri, and the suspect. Every piece of duct tape was examined for impressions or residues that could connect it to a particular source. Meanwhile, law enforcement turned again to the public. Media coverage expanded significantly after Tammy's body was found. News outlets in Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa covered the details of her disappearance and death, including the descriptions of her vehicle, her last known location, and the items missing from her belongings. Public appeals urged anyone with information to come forward, whether it was about suspicious trucks, unusual behavior at rest stops, or sightings of Tammy in the days after she was last seen. Flyers were distributed across truck stops, gas stations, and way stations, focusing especially on the trucking community. The description of the tall, dark-haired truck driver was circulated widely. Interviews with truck drivers and motorists became another focus. Authorities questioned those who had been traveling Interstate 80 and Interstate 44 during the critical time frame. They asked about unusual vehicles, roadside encounters, or suspicious individuals. While many truckers offered cooperation and information, none provided a lead that conclusively identified a suspect. Still, these interviews helped investigators piece together a broader understanding of traffic flow and possible routes the perpetrator may have used. The geography of the crime scene was also analyzed. Investigators studied the location where Tammy's body was found in relation to exits, rest stops, and nearby towns. They considered whether the location suggested a planned disposal site, a random roadside stop, or a place chosen because the killer was familiar with it. Tire tracks found near the site were documented, though it was difficult to confirm whether they belonged to the truck driver described earlier or to another vehicle. For Tammy's family, the discovery of her body brought devastating confirmation of what they had feared since she went missing. Her mother, Jo Zywicki, was notified immediately. The family cooperated fully with authorities, providing details about Tammy's personal life, her travel habits, and her relationships. They confirmed again that Tammy had no boyfriend, no intentions of leaving her life voluntarily, and no reason to disappear on her own. This eliminated any lingering doubt that she might have left willingly, solidifying the investigation's focus on abduction and murder. The brutality of the crime, multiple stab wounds, sexual assault, transportation across state lines, indicated to investigators that the offender was both dangerous and deliberate. This was not an accidental encounter or random event. It pointed to someone willing to take risks, someone wild. Ho had both the time and opportunity to abduct Tammy and transport her hundreds of miles. Whether that individual was the truck driver seen on Interstate 80 or someone else entirely remained the critical, unanswered question. The investigation pressed forward with the knowledge that time was working against them. Every day that passed made it harder to trace the movements of trucks, drivers, and vehicles on the interstates. Every day created more distance between the killer and the evidence. Yet law enforcement agencies at all levels remained engaged. They coordinated across jurisdictions, shared forensic reports, and continued to track down every lead. Despite the extensive work, the forensics, the interviews, the public appeals, and the federal coordination, no arrests were made in the immediate aftermath. The case shifted into the category of open but unsolved, with investigators holding on to the belief that the forensic evidence, particularly DNA, might one day provide the breakthrough needed to identify Tammy's killer. The discovery of Tammy Jo Zywicki's body on September 1st, 1992, changed everything. It provided answers to one set of questions while opening many more. It confirmed her fate, but left unresolved who was responsible, how they had carried out the crime, and why they had targeted her. From that day forward, the case was not only about finding a missing young woman, but about pursuing justice for a life stolen, and about uncovering the truth behind one of the most haunting interstate mysteries of the early 1990s. Following the discovery of Tammy Jo Zywicki's body on September 1st, 1992, in Lawrence County, Missouri, law enforcement and federal agencies shifted their focus entirely toward forensic analysis and evidence collection to identify a perpetrator. What had once been categorized as a missing person investigation now transitioned fully into a homicide investigation. This shift meant that every detail, physical evidence, forensic findings, witness statements, and potential links to other unsolved crimes needed to be examined with a heightened degree of urgency and precision. Tammy's body had been found wrapped in a red blanket and secured with duct tape, an effort by the perpetrator to conceal or transport her remains. The medical examiner determined that she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. Forensic investigators immediately documented every aspect of her condition. They recorded the wound patterns with photographs, diagrams, and written reports. Each stab wound was measured, cataloged, and compared against possible weapon types. Signs of restraint were noted, as were the specific ways in which the duct tape had been applied to bind and seal her body. The positioning of her remains inside the blanket was carefully documented, as this detail could suggest whether the concealment had been hurried, methodical, or ritualistic in nature. Biological samples were collected from Tammy's body with meticulous care. Blood samples, hair strands, and potential semen evidence were secured. In 1992, DNA analysis was still in its earlier stages compared to modern technology, but investigators recognized the future importance of these materials. Each sample was preserved under strict chain of custody protocols to guarantee its admissibility in court if and when a suspect could be identified. Every hand that touched the evidence, every transfer of material from one place to another was logged to protect the integrity of the case. The duct tape used to wrap Tammy's body was also of immense forensic interest. Investigators cut sections of the tape, preserving both adhesive sides for analysis. The sticky surfaces could contain fingerprints, skin cells, or fibers left behind by the perpetrator. The tape's chemical composition and brand type were also noted. Such details could potentially be traced to a manufacturer, a distributor, or even a specific region where the tape was commonly sold. Similarly, the red blanket that encased Tammy was photographed, cataloged, and analyzed. Investigators examined its material, stitching, and fiber type, considering whether it was a household blanket, a commercially distributed product, or one potentially associated with truck cabins or other transient living spaces. If the blanket could be linked to a specific origin, it might lead directly to a suspect, or at least narrow the investigative field. The missing personal items added another layer of complexity to the case. Tammy's Canon 35mm camera and her musical wristwatch were notably absent when her body was discovered. Law enforcement debated internally whether these items had been taken as trophies by the perpetrator, kept as personal reminders of the crime, or removed deliberately to obscure her identity. In some homicide cases, personal belongings are stolen for financial gain, but in others, they become psychological souvenirs. Determining which motive applied in Tammy's case was essential to building an offender profile. Attention also returned to Tammy's abandoned vehicle, the white 1985 Pontiac T1000 that had been found along Interstate 80 in LaSalle County, Illinois. Forensic teams examined it again, this time with a sharper focus on any potential correlation to the Missouri crime scene. The car was dusted repeatedly for fingerprints. Fibers embedded in the upholstery were analyzed under microscopes to identify whether foreign material had been transferred from the perpetrator. The carpeting and floor mats were examined for hairs, soil, or other debris that might match evidence near the body's discovery site. Investigators also checked the condition of the car itself, confirming whether it had broken down naturally or whether foul play, tampering, or mechanical interference had caused Tammy to stop along the highway. The car's precise position off the roadway was mapped and photographed to understand how it had come to rest there. Witness statements played a vital role in reconstructing the timeline. Multiple motorists reported seeing Tammy standing beside her disabled vehicle on Interstate 80. Others recalled a tractor-trailer truck parked nearby, with its driver matching the description of a white male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, over 6 feet tall, with dark, bushy hair. Investigators cross-referenced these witness accounts with trucking company records, commercial driver logs, and interstate weigh station entries. They attempted to identify any truckers who might have been in the LaSalle County area during the critical window of time. Even the smallest inconsistency in a driver's log could become an investigative lead. Because Tammy's body had been found in Missouri, roughly 350 miles from where her vehicle had been abandoned in Illinois, the case clearly spanned multiple jurisdictions. Federal authorities, including the FBI, became heavily involved. The interstate transportation of a victim not only expanded the geographical scope of the crime, but also underscored the likelihood that the offender was someone accustomed to long-distance travel. The FBI added Tammy's case to national databases, cross-referencing it against other unsolved homicides and disappearances. They searched specifically for cases involving young women traveling alone on major highways who had later been found assaulted or murdered. The goal was to identify patterns that could indicate a serial offender operating across multiple states. Forensic laboratories began conducting DNA profiling on the biological samples. Though limited compared to modern standards, the technology available in 1992 could still generate meaningful results if a suspect's DNA was available for comparison. Samples of semen and hair were tested to extract profiles. Even if these profiles could not immediately identify a suspect, preserving them meant they could be compared against databases as they expanded in the coming years. The medical examiner's analysis of Tammy's injuries also provided critical insight into the attack. The number and location of stab wounds were studied to determine the level of aggression and the type of weapon used. Such details could indicate whether the attack was impulsive or calculated. Investigators broadened their attention to trucking routes, particularly Interstate 80 and Interstate 44. These highways were major corridors for commercial transportation, used daily by thousands of long-haul truck drivers. Law enforcement obtained commercial vehicle records, including license plate numbers, driver schedules, and cargo manifests. These records were cross-referenced with witness descriptions of the tractor-trailer driver seen near Tammy's vehicle. Truck stops, weigh stations, and fuel purchase logs were examined to pinpoint drivers who may have been in both Illinois and Missouri during the period of Tammy's disappearance and the discovery of her body. Interviews with Tammy's family and friends were also central to the investigation. Authorities sought to confirm details of her personal life, her travel habits, and her state of mind before leaving Evanston. Her family confirmed that Tammy had no boyfriend at the time and had no reason to leave her life voluntarily. Friends recalled her excitement about returning to Grinnell College and her dedication to her studies. These testimonies helped eliminate the possibility that Tammy had disappeared willingly, further underscoring that she was the victim of a crime committed by an external party. Public appeals remained one of the strongest tools for generating leads. Law enforcement distributed Tammy's photograph, a description of her vehicle, and details about her disappearance through local and national media outlets. Press conferences were held to keep the case visible. Trucking companies and interstate rest stops received flyers urging drivers to come forward with any information about sightings of Tammy, her car, or suspicious activity. Tips from the public were logged, cataloged, and followed up by investigators, with each potential lead being carefully weighed against existing evidence. Criminal profile. Lawyers were consulted to develop a behavioral analysis of the unknown perpetrator. Profilers considered whether the crime indicated premeditation, suggesting a planned abduction, or whether it was an opportunistic act against a vulnerable motorist. The fact that Tammy had been transported across state lines, sexually assaulted, stabbed multiple times, and then wrapped in a blanket suggested a combination of control, violence, and concealment. Profilers evaluated whether this combination matched patterns seen in known offenders or serial predators targeting women along highways. Every piece of evidence collected was cataloged meticulously. The crime scene photographs, the forensic reports, the fibers from the blanket, the DNA samples, the adhesive residue from the duct tape, and the witness statements all became part of a massive case file. These records were kept secure and updated as new leads emerged. Each item of evidence was seen not just as an isolated detail, but as part of a broader mosaic that might eventually point to the perpetrator. Despite the extensive forensic work, the coordination between multiple agencies, and the flood of public attention, no immediate arrests were made in Tammy's case. The possibility that the truck driver seen near her car was involved remained one of the strongest leads, but investigators were unable to conclusively link him or any other individual to both the scene in Illinois and the homicide in Missouri. The case remained open, with investigators continuing to re-examine old evidence, pursue new forensic technologies, and cross-check Tammy's case with other unsolved highway crimes. The hope persisted that one piece of evidence, whether DNA, a fingerprint, a fiber, or a witness testimony, would eventually provide the breakthrough needed to bring justice for Tammy Jo Zywicki. Following the discovery of Tammy Jo Zywicki's body on September 1, 1992, law enforcement found themselves at the beginning of a long, complex investigation that spanned multiple states and jurisdictions. The young woman's death was not just another tragic loss, but a disturbing mystery that demanded answers. Who had crossed her path that day on Interstate 80? Who had taken her life? And could the clues left behind along the highways of Illinois and Missouri lead to the truth? The first step for investigators was to retrace Tammy's last known movements and identify who she may have encountered after her car broke down on the side of the road. Her 1985 Pontiac T1000 had been found abandoned along Interstate 80 in LaSalle County, Illinois, with no sign of Tammy nearby. Witnesses quickly became critical to the timeline. Several individuals reported seeing a white male truck driver, roughly 35 to 40 years old, standing near Tammy's disabled vehicle. He was described as tall, well over 6 feet, with dark, bushy hair. Some said he appeared to be assisting her. Others couldn't be sure. But for investigators, this was the first solid lead. Whoever this man was, he might have been the last person to see Tammy alive. Authorities began the painstaking process of narrowing down possibilities. They reached out to trucking companies across the Midwest, checking driver logs, schedules, and employee records for anyone matching the description. Highway patrol officers were asked to recall unusual incidents. Truck stops and rest areas along Interstate 80 were canvassed for potential witnesses. Despite the urgency, progress was slow. Thousands of truck drivers moved across those highways every day, and pinning down one individual with only a vague physical description was like searching for a single grain of sand on a beach. Still, investigators refused to let the lead go cold. At the same time, law enforcement examined whether other motorists could have interacted with Tammy in the critical window after her car became disabled. They looked into patterns of truck traffic, the schedules of long-haul drivers, and the common stopping points between Illinois and Missouri. Vehicle registrations were checked. Commercial driver records were pulled and cross-referenced. Anyone who might have been in proximity to the area during that time frame was scrutinized. But the truck driver was not the only avenue. Investigators also considered other possibilities: acquaintances of Tammy, strangers who may have crossed her path, and individuals with prior criminal records, especially those tied to sexual assault or violent crimes along interstate highways. Every potential lead, no matter how small, was followed. Phone records, activity logs, and tips from the public were cataloged and cross-referenced. Witness sightings were checked for accuracy, and even the smallest inconsistencies were noted in case they became significant later. One of the biggest challenges was jurisdiction. Tammy's vehicle had been abandoned in Illinois, but her body was found nearly 500 miles away in Missouri, near Interstate 44. This meant Illinois authorities, Missouri law enforcement, and the FBI all had to coordinate their efforts. Evidence collected in LaSalle County needed to be carefully linked with evidence in Lawrence County, Missouri. Any mistake in chain of custody could compromise the case. The FBI provided assistance in managing this multi-state investigation, but coordinating across different jurisdictions was always complicated. Forensic work became another cornerstone of the case. Investigators compared evidence from Tammy's abandoned Pontiac with evidence collected at the crime scene in Missouri. They examined fingerprints, hair, fibers, and biological samples. Each item was carefully cataloged, studied, and analyzed to determine if there was any overlap that could point to a suspect. The hope was that something, anything, would connect the truck driver seen near Tammy's car to the location where her body was later discovered. Forensics at the time, however, lacked the precision we now take for granted with DNA technology, and results often came back inconclusive. Recognizing that this might not be an isolated crime, federal investigators also entered Tammy's case into national databases. They began reviewing unsolved homicides of young women who had disappeared while traveling alone on major highways. Were there other victims with similar profiles? Could this be the work of a serial offender? Behavioral analysts examined patterns, victim demographics, methods of attack, and the way bodies were left behind. Some details suggested opportunism, while others hinted at planning. Investigators could not ignore the possibility that Tammy's killer might have struck before or might strike again. Public involvement was also crucial. Media outlets across Illinois, Missouri, and neighboring states broadcast Tammy's story. Newspapers ran her photo, descriptions of her car, and details of the suspected truck driver. Authorities pleaded with the public to come forward with information about suspicious activity on the highways in late August of 1992. Truck drivers, motorists, and even residents living near the highways were urged to recall anything unusual. Investigators also turned to the trucking industry for help. They interviewed company employees, long-haul drivers, and highway patrol officers, asking whether anyone had encountered a driver matching the description given by witnesses. They wanted to know if any trucker had been seen offering assistance to motorists around that time, or if any driver's behavior had raised suspicion. Roadside assistance records were combed through as well. If anyone had reported Tammy's breakdown, or even just a stranded vehicle on Interstate 80, investigators wanted to know. These reports were cross-referenced with trucking logs and witness statements in order to build the most accurate timeline possible of Tammy's last hours. Behavioral profilers also became deeply involved. They studied Tammy's disappearance and the circumstances of her murder to build a psychological picture of the perpetrator. Was the attack opportunistic, a random crime committed by someone who saw a vulnerable young woman alone on the roadside? Or was it premeditated, carried out by someone who specifically targeted women along interstates? The concealment of Tammy's body and the removal of certain personal items suggested intentional behavior. Her camera and wristwatch were missing, and investigators questioned whether these were taken as trophies or simply stolen items of convenience. The meaning behind these actions was debated, but all possibilities were noted. Despite the scale of the investigation, progress was frustratingly slow. Weeks passed, then months, and no arrests were made. The truck driver seen near Tammy's car remained the strongest lead, but without solid evidence, he could not be confirmed. Other suspects were investigated and eliminated, but the absence of clear proof meant that the case remained open. Every tip, every phone call, every statement was documented and stored in the case file, creating an extensive record of the investigation. Law enforcement also studied the distances involved in Tammy's abduction and murder. Her car in Illinois, her body in Missouri. Was this distance evidence of planning? Did the perpetrator intend to transport her across state lines to delay discovery? Or was it simply the result of an opportunistic crime committed by someone whose work required long-distance travel, like a truck driver? Investigators studied travel routes, rest areas, and potential stopping points along the interstates to reconstruct how the killer might have moved from Illinois to Missouri. Despite exhaustive work, the investigation remained unsolved, but authorities never gave up. Tammy's case stayed active, her file continually updated with new tips, new technology, and renewed appeals for public assistance. Her story became part of a larger pattern of unsolved cases involving women on highways, fueling speculation that her killer might have been a serial predator moving through the Midwest. Years have passed since the disappearance and murder of Tammy Jo Zywicki. Decades later, law enforcement continues to chase leads, follow fragments of evidence, and apply every new technology available in the hope of solving one of the most haunting cold cases in Illinois and Missouri. On August 23, 1992, Tammy, a bright and determined 21-year-old college student, vanished after her car broke down along Interstate 80 in Illinois. She was on her way back to school after dropping her younger brother off at college, but she never made it. 9 days later, on September 1st, her body was found nearly 250 miles away along Interstate 44 in Lawrence County, Missouri. She had been bound, sexually assaulted, and stabbed to death. From the beginning, the investigation stretched across multiple states. The Illinois State Police took the lead at the scene of Tammy's disappearance. Missouri State Highway Patrol joined once. Her body was discovered. Local law enforcement agencies were drawn in, and soon the FBI added federal resources to the effort. The case crossed state lines, involving 2 separate crime scenes, and with it came the enormous challenge of coordination among different jurisdictions. The earliest focus of investigators was the eyewitness reports. Several motorists driving along Interstate 80 recalled seeing a young woman standing near her disabled 1985 Pontiac T1000. Some remembered a large tractor-trailer parked close by. Others recalled a white male truck driver, somewhere between 35 and 40 years old, well over 6 feet tall, with dark, bushy hair. He seemed to match the kind of figure who might have stopped to offer help, or perhaps something far more sinister. That description became the first real lead. Law enforcement combed through trucking company records, driver rosters, and commercial vehicle registrations. They tracked down and interviewed dozens of long-haul truckers who were known to be on Interstate 80 that day. They tried to pinpoint who had been driving in that stretch of Illinois around the time Tammy broke down. But despite all those efforts, no definitive identification of the man was ever made. The mysterious truck driver became a ghost in the case file, someone who might have been the killer, or might have simply been a good Samaritan whose name was lost to time. While witness reports were being sorted through, forensic teams went to work on Tammy's car. The small Pontiac was carefully processed for fingerprints, hair, fibers, and any trace evidence that could point to who had been near the vehicle. Investigators hoped that whoever approached Tammy on the highway might have left behind something: a smudge of a fingerprint, a strand of hair, a fragment of clothing fiber. Every scrap was documented and preserved. At the same time, Tammy's clothing and the evidence collected near her body in Missouri were examined. Biological samples, fibers, and even potential fingerprints were stored. In 1992, DNA testing was still in its early years, limited in what it could reveal, but investigators had the foresight to preserve everything they could, holding onto it for the day when science would catch up. Years later, as forensic technology advanced, those same samples were pulled out again and again. Each time, new methods were applied: more sensitive DNA analysis, more refined techniques for identifying trace fibers. The evidence was run against national DNA databases, compared to thousands of profiles in the hope of a match. But even with decades of technological progress, the results never delivered a definitive suspect. The FBI and state investigators also looked outward, searching for patterns. They examined Tammy's case alongside other unsolved highway murders. Across the United States, especially during the late 1980s and early 1990s, young women traveling alone often became targets of violence. Many were last seen near interstates, truck stops, or service plazas. Were these crimes connected? Could Tammy have been one of many victims of a serial offender who prowled America's highways? Profilers were brought in to study the details of the case. Tammy had been abducted from a busy interstate, attacked, and her body transported across state lines before being left near a rural stretch of I-44. The brutality of the stabbing, the sexual assault, and the way her body was discarded all painted a chilling picture. Behavioral experts debated whether the killer was an opportunist who saw a vulnerable woman on the side of the road, or someone who had planned for such an encounter, using the highways as hunting grounds. The truck driver lead remained the most compelling. Truckers had the mobile, IT, the privacy, and the opportunity to commit crimes far from home. They could pick up victims in one state and leave them in another, making investigations extraordinarily difficult. FBI agents reviewed logbooks, checked fuel receipts, and traced long-haul routes that intersected with Interstate 80. They examined trucking companies that operated across Illinois and Missouri. But once again, no single driver emerged as the clear suspect. Public appeals became a central part of the investigation. Tammy's face was placed on television, in newspapers, and on missing person flyers. The FBI urged anyone who had been traveling Interstate 80 on August 23, 1992, to come forward with even the smallest detail. Did they see a stranded young woman? Did they notice a truck pulled over? Did they recall anything unusual in the flow of traffic that afternoon? Some tips trickled in. A few seemed promising, pointing again to truck drivers or to unusual activity near Tammy's vehicle. Each one was chased down. Each one ended without the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. Over the years, the case file only grew larger. Detectives built profiles of Tammy's final hours, logging every witness statement, every forensic test, every trucking record. Cold case units revisited the evidence again and again, hoping fresh eyes might catch something that had been overlooked. The FBI compared Tammy's case with new databases, linking it against similar crimes to look for repeating offender patterns. Still, the trail remained stubbornly cold. But investigators never stopped emphasizing one thing: someone out there knows the truth. Maybe it's the truck driver who stopped that day. Maybe it's another motorist who saw more than they realized. Or maybe it's a person who once heard a confession, offhand words spoken in a moment of guilt or bravado that never made it to police. Even today, Tammy's case continues to be highlighted by cold case programs and documentaries. Media coverage ensures that her name isn't forgotten, that her story remains alive in the public's memory. Law enforcement still encourages anyone with information to come forward, no matter how small it may seem. Tammy's family has carried the weight of this tragedy for decades. They've worked alongside investigators, spoken publicly, and joined advocacy efforts to keep attention on unsolved murders. For them, the pain of unanswered questions never fades. Each update from law enforcement brings hope, but also frustration as years pass without an arrest. Theories about the killer have evolved over time. Some investigators are convinced the truck driver was responsible. Others believe Tammy may have been targeted by a different predator, perhaps a motorist who happened to pass at the wrong moment. Still others wonder if her abduction was the work of someone familiar with the interstates, someone who had thought through exactly how to commit such a crime without being caught. One of the most hopeful avenues today lies in advanced DNA technology. In recent years, familial DNA testing and forensic genealogy have solved cases once thought unsolvable. By identifying relatives of an unknown suspect through public genealogy databases, investigators can work backward to narrow down possible perpetrators. Tammy's preserved evidence holds the potential for such testing, and federal agencies continue to monitor developments in the field. For now, though, the case remains officially unsolved. No arrest has ever been made. No one has ever been charged with Tammy Jo Zywicki's murder. What remains are the fragments of a story: a car left abandoned, a young woman's life brutally taken, and a trail that stretches across hundreds of miles of interstate highway. But the investigation has never been abandoned. Detectives still review the case, still re-examine the files, and still push the evidence through every new scientific tool available. To them, and to Tammy's family, the hope remains that one day, the right piece of information, or the right scientific breakthrough, will finally bring her killer to justice. Until then, Tammy Jo Zywicki's story remains one of the most haunting mysteries of America's highways, a reminder of how quickly an ordinary trip can turn into tragedy, and a case that refuses to fade away no matter how many years go by.